I think a lot of people my age are driven away by like perceived hypocrisy in the church. I find that getting back to basics is often like really, really important, at least for me. Like when I'm really, really mad at the church, when I've really just like had enough with people preaching one thing and practicing another, or people preaching things that are totally contrary to the gospel, um, that what brings me back and what keeps me reaching out to God. And, for me, that also means reaching out to the church, like trying to get to mass or like trying to pray, um, is being reminded of the absolute essentials, like, God created you, God loves you. This is this community that's been given to you, warts and all.
Welcome to Read, Pray, Write Spiritual Reading for Modern Life. I am Jean Kelly. Today, we are gifted with the presence of Colleen Dulle, who is the multimedia correspondent covering Catholic and Vatican news at America Media. And she writes and produces a weekly podcast called Inside the Vatican. And she also served as an ABC News correspondent during the 2025 Papal Conclave. And she's also contributed to many other media organizations. Welcome, Colleen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So today, Colleen and I are going to be talking about her latest book, and Colleen has read an excerpt from that you can find linked on our website, www.readpraywrite.com, as well as in our show notes on YouTube as a distinct episode. It'll be part of a guided spiritual reading. And the book is Struck Down, Not Destroyed, Keeping the Faith as a Vatican Reporter, which is very hard to do. So we're going to be talking about that. So I encourage you to check out the excerpt. But what I'd like to do, Colleen, is start with the beginning. And I want to know about why this title and why this cover art.
Well, the title is a quote from St. Paul, right from the second letter to the Corinthians, where he says, and I'm not going to remember the whole thing, but like, we are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are struck down, but not destroyed. And he's talking about the persecuted Christians in the time that he's writing. But it's kind of an interesting inversion of it, or a different take on it, to say, well, so many Catholics, so many Christians these days feel, if not persecuted, at least feel alienated or disillusioned with their own church. They feel that their faith has been shaken, has been struck down, but they're still hanging on. And so I really wanted to give voice to that. Um, the I have a very unique situation where I have a front row view to a lot of these really ugly stories in the Catholic Church, and then at the same time, uh, I'm still holding on to faith, which not everybody on the Vatican beat is, and like no judgment about that because I get how disillusioning it is. And I've also seen people go the other way. They come into Vatican reporting without any religious background and they leave a Catholic. So, but yeah, so it kind of seemed like it had to be both things at once. People are looking for spiritual nourishment. I think that was something that Matt, my editor, was very aware of and wants to offer in the books that he's publishing. Something that's just straight Vatican reporting. I think you might ask, like, why should I listen to somebody who's relatively new on this beat? I've been doing it for 8 years, but I'm not full-time in Rome yet. So yeah, it was always, even from the start, going to be a combination, and it was a thing that I had to get used to as a reporter, getting more comfortable with that. But I also think that it aligns really well with a lot of the directions that the journalism industry is going, and we can talk more about that if you want to.
Very good. Very good. Yes. And as a lifelong Catholic myself, I really appreciated your reporting aspect of it, the clear-eyed, even-handed insider analysis of really
Thanks.
important topics for Catholics. I learned so much, especially the chapter, the financial skullduggery, making saints. I am also a volunteer for Dorothy Day's cause. So like, whoa, that was an eye opener. But I really just appreciate your intelligence and courage and the way you found common ground rather than seeding further division.
That's really important these days.
And you just celebrated the folks who are really humbly dedicated to civility, to discernment, and while at the same time being honest about your personal frustrations and anguish, really, over human failings of the institutional church. And I know that is not easy to do. But I think that is what believers of all faiths can find in this book, value in that approach, to kind of hold things that are in non-duality, right? Not no but,
Yeah.
yes and so even if folks are not Catholic, if I think mature faith requires that wrestling as Jacob with the angel, and discernment, for it to be something you can sustain over time.
I think that the great lesson of Pope Francis' papacy was teaching us that a lot of life is lived in the gray areas. And his response to that was to reach out to people who are living in those gray areas and like encourage us all to discern and like really take our faith into our own hands. Whereas, maybe in past decades, certainly in past centuries, people who were not like living the church's ideal were just kind of left aside. But that's not most of our reality. And so I wanted to give voice to that and also make people feel like if they're having a hard time wrestling through that, they're not alone.
I think that somewhere in the book you said that's normal, right? That's not
Yeah.
wrong, even for really devout Catholics who, I think you're right. I think the Pope Francis had that very Jesuit pastoral mentality, that said the messiness of human life is requires that kind of discernment, and that to
Yeah,
be
and God meets us there too, right?
meets us there. So yes. And so I guess one of my really obvious questions at this point, is that I think you characterize how ugliness threatens to eclipse the beauty of our shared Catholic faith. And so what's the question is, why do you stay? If you can, I know the book's about that, but if you could sum it up in a couple sentences.
Yeah. My my book is my effort to answer that question, and I don't know that it ever gives like one clean, nice answer. Like it really is just a long process of, ongoing relationship with this institution, right? Like I think by the end of the book, I start to realize and communicate more that the institution isn't just this like, kind of faceless thing. It's not just like this big stone facade of the basilica in Rome. It's a lot of different people, and some of those people are, doing really good stuff, and some people are doing really not so good stuff, and some people are just indifferent and, are part of this institution because. And yeah, I think so. The reason that I say the thing that keeps me staying is that it is a relationship, that it's a relationship with a lot of different people, that it's also a relationship with the larger institution and ultimately a relationship with God. And like I'll never ever leave that, There's yeah, I don't know, I think that that community, that network of relationships is worth fighting for, and I think that even when I feel pulled in different directions or even when I'm disappointed in some of the people who are part of it, I can't let go of the thing because I mean it's like my village, right? It's I There is no way for me to extricate myself from that. Um at least I think there is. People who, do deconstruction end up doing that and they build a network of other meaningful relationships. But for me, I really don't want to.
That is makes sense to me. And so I know that you talked about a lot of people, your kind of peer age group, often ask you to explain what's going on in the Vatican, but also
Yeah, right.
ask you that question. Do you give them that same answer or something similar to that? Or do you have a different answer for them?
Kind of depends on the situation of the person who's in front of me. But yeah, certainly, people come to me having seen like headlines about the church and they're like, okay, number one, like, what the heck does this mean? Because I'm not reading all that. And two, uh, what does this mean for my relationship or for their relationship uh with the church? And like the situations that are like really really sad, I think, are when people see something and they're like, well, what does this mean for my relationship with God? um and that's really hard, and so yeah, I do like try to just sit with the person who's in front of me, and I much like I do in this book, I turn to stories a lot. So I'll try to bring people stories of at least like how I've wrestled with this in the past or ways that I know that other people are wrestling with this. Um, I just really think there's so much value in communicating to people that they're not by themselves. And I think that sharing stories, I gave a whole talk on this in Canada last week, but like sharing stories is our way of reckoning with the truth. And reckoning with the truth is a necessary step to take before you can heal, right? You have to accept all of it before you can make any steps towards moving on.
Yes, and my Benedictine preparation was self-acceptance, self-knowledge, self-gift in that order.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yes. So, and I think the excerpt that Colleen read, that will be a distinct episode, was getting at some of those ideas of community where you express, moving from I to we, as really ending on a hopeful note. That's what's so wonderful about the book as a way forward for the church. And I really do think for any church, right? Whatever denomination and individuals, is through that listening, that dialogue, that community.
I think a lot of people my age are driven away by like perceived hypocrisy in the church. I find that getting back to basics is often like really, really important, at least for me. Like when I'm really, really mad at the church, when I've really just like had enough with people preaching one thing and practicing another, or people preaching things that are totally contrary to the gospel, um, that what brings me back and what keeps me reaching out to God. And, for me, that also means reaching out to the church, like trying to get to mass or like trying to pray, um, is being reminded of the absolute essentials, like, God created you, God loves you. This is this community that's been given to you, warts and all. Um, yeah, I just, especially having a kid of my own now, like I write about this a little bit in the afterword, but it has brought me back to a lot of the very basics of Catholicism, of Christianity, and what I'm trying to teach him. And so I think, maybe for parents with adult kids, trying to get back to those basics and communicate those again might at least open the door.
And you shared so many beautiful stories about both yelling at God and then having truly mystical comfort from God. And those are, I think, things that parents can share, or anybody trying to invite folks to coming to a faith community, is that this is a place where you're wanted, invited, in however you experience
Hmm.
faith. And that's one of the things I wanted to segue a little bit to, because you talked about getting back to basics. You said prayer and mass. So some of those practices that you were raised with kind of were what you see as foundational. And so I was curious, do you practice Lectio Divina at all? The spiritual reading, like, is core to this podcast?
Very rarely.
Mhm.
I think the only times that I've like really done it a lot are like on retreats. So, for example, that chapter that I have about, this revelation that I had about wrestling with God, like Jacob with the angel, like that came from a specifically like Ignatian spiritual exercise type of reading of that scripture passage, and like that has sustained me for so long. Just that one reflection. Um, but no, I'll go through phases where I am reading the Gospel of the day. And as part of my job in America, we do write these uh, scripture reflections daily for our subscribers. Uh, and so I have to write one of those maybe like every month, usually around the 20th or so is when my cycle comes back. And so that is like at least one time a month that I'm sitting down really intentionally with the readings of the day and saying like, okay, what's speaking to me here and what can I draw out for the people who are going to be reading this reflection. But that's kind of the extent of it for me.
That makes sense. Yes. And that's really traditional Lectio Divina. And that's one of the reasons I kind of in the podcast give people the permission to think of spiritual reading of any kind of text, including music or artwork. Visio Divina, we have episodes of Audio Divina. And I know that you might have some other spiritual practices that you find valuable or, again, foundational. So just curious what those might be.
Yeah, I centering prayer. I only recently found out that the thing I do is called that. But for me it's just, kind of how I've always prayed. Um, in
Can you
fact,
explain
just
that a little bit to those folks who might not be familiar with centering prayer?
oh, sure. Well, again, like only recently found out this term. But essentially what I like to do in prayer is to try to quiet myself, open my heart, make myself aware of God's presence, and then as much as possible try to like yeah, sit in that quiet and sit in that peace and then see what comes up. Um, I'm pretty bad at it these days. I'm a little out of practice, but I've been trying to get back in touch. In fact, just the other night, I ran into the nun who I write about in the book, who I saw praying when I was in middle school, and she looked so joyful and peaceful, and I was like, I want that. And like, so that is when I really started trying to like take the advice that she would dole out at our all school assemblies and stuff, um, to on how to do that exact kind of prayer. And like, that's what has kept me going. So I had a long, long talk with her the other night about prayer. I stayed up way past my bedtime. And then the other thing is, I had a period of like years when I would go and sit and try to pray. This probably lasted like 4 years, and all I would hear back is right, right, right. And so that has become a big part of my prayer practice too, especially now that I'm a lot more scattered. I've got more going on. I've got a toddler running around and all that. Journaling, I've always written my journals as like letters to God, and so yeah, that's a way that I can like keep myself focused on my prayer, and I really treasure those journals.
Mhm. And that is your God-given talent and skill. So it makes
It's
sense
how I've always
when you
processed the world. Yeah.
use the world. And that's why this podcast is called Read, Pray, Write. Because the response step for me is almost always writing. So
Hmm.
yes. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is that, in this podcast, I've made spiritual reading 5 steps where it's the fifth step is something I call resolve. And I'm making an effort. I've done a couple like podcast mini series called Finding Your Resolve that in a more explicit way try to connect spiritual practices like centering prayer, meditation to action. I think
Hmm.
there's a lot of misconception sometimes that they're not connected, and that the folks who give us things like Lectio Divina, the monks, they're separated from the world, which is of course not true. So I wanted to know if in any explicit way, any spiritual practices you have connects to social action or service, and what those would be, and how you see that connecting.
I think what I can say is that when I have a regular prayer practice going, um, that appears throughout the day and prompts me to small actions that then I feel like contribute to something bigger. This all sounds really vague, but like basically when when I have like a regular like morning prayer, say, then throughout the day I get these moments where either I'm consciously doing it or not, where I'm like reconnecting with God and just like taking a second. And maybe in that moment, I'll feel prompted to do something like send a text to a certain person, or like send an email reaching out to somebody who I know has been struggling, or maybe even just like, okay, this time, like roll down your window and give money to the homeless guy at the stoplight. And I think that those little actions are all playing a role in something bigger than I can see. Now, maybe in terms of my like vocation as a journalist, like I do think it's super important for me to speak out on social issues. To This is the old adage, right? To afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And so yeah, I think that I try to bring it in my writing that way. And certainly in my like writing to God, it comes out a lot. Um, this is all kind of jumbled. I don't know that I'm actually answering your question, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like
I
having a
think
regular
what
prayer
you're getting
practice puts me in a yeah.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is a really interesting way to turn the question on its head, which is it's not necessarily a conscious connection between, oh, I prayed the day and I discerned what I was supposed to do. It
Yeah.
it has a kind of a subconscious or unconscious cumulative effect because you've put yourself in a frame of mind that
Yeah. And I
makes
do
you
believe that.
aware. I mean, it's to me, it's a
Hmm.
awareness of the nearness of God, or
Exactly. The presence of God in other people.
right.
And certainly also like when there have been bigger things, like bigger actions or whatever, if I'm saying like, okay, like I remember a few years ago discerning, like according to Ignatian discernment, like in prayer, should I get arrested at this protest or should I just go cover it as a reporter? Like that's something that, yeah, that's one of those like one-to-one relationships between the prayer
Right.
and the
So you
action.
put in a specific request.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, pretty soon here I'm going to take part in this parents fast for Gaza, right? And like when I'm doing that, I know I'm going to be hanging on God a lot in those like moments of hunger and trying to old school language like offer it up, but like, direct some of that intention, some of that energy towards peace and towards, people who don't get to choose to be hungry. But
And
yeah,
ask
it's
for accompaniment if nothing else, right? Like
yeah,
it's
exactly, exactly. So
and
I don't know. I do believe though that like, prayer is the first step towards the action and that prayer informs the action. It's just that it's not as like one to one as it might
well, plus
seem.
there are life stages and times
For
that you
sure.
more time for that. And as you said, you have a toddler and you have an important job. And I don't know how you did all these things and birthed a book about the same time you birthed a child. So props to you. It's not easy. Not even close to easy. So I was really interested in the sort of the spiritual memoir part, I think, of your book, where you were really, you had the reporting part, but then you were very vulnerable and sometimes and willing to have the courage to say this was kind of a mystical experience and share that. There just were so many beautiful things where you show your faith as ardent, sincere, alongside some of your skepticism and your discernment about how to stay. So, is there from the book a particularly favorite anecdote? You mentioned the sister. Can you tell me more about that and recall the anecdote when you saw her? I found that was really interesting early experience you had. I think you called yourself
Yeah.
a little teen mystic.
I did say that that was what I became after that experience. Yeah, and I mean, I'll just say off the bat too, like I feel like I suck at talking about this stuff. Like it comes out a lot more naturally on the page, I think. And so I'm still very much like getting used to talking about this. I feel a little bit better than when the book first came out, when the idea of anyone reading it just made me feel like I was going to throw up. But um, yeah, and also this is so fresh to me because I did just like have a first like encounter with her for the first time in years, so it's all really fresh right now. But yeah, so I was in eighth grade, I think, and we had this all school mass. I went to a Sacred Heart school in St. Charles, Missouri, and there we have the shrine of St. Philippine Duchesne. And so I'm like sitting there on one side of the shrine in the front row, and this nun, Sister Glavin, is sitting in like the next section over. And after communion, I saw her praying, and there was just like this one perfect moment when she like she had her eyes closed and she lifted her head up and like there's all these different colors coming in from the stained glass and they're like kind of throwing colors around on her face and her hair and she looked so at peace. And this is a nun who like she started at the school when I was in fourth grade. So for the last 4 years I'd been hearing her every school assembly, every mass, like getting up, telling us the same thing to like, take time to quiet ourselves, to open our hearts, to put ourselves in touch with God's Sacred Heart, because that was the spirituality of the school. And every day at 3:05, she would get on the PA system and ring a bell, and for 5 minutes the whole school would have silent time. And like after I saw her praying that day, I was like, okay, like I'm gonna start using quiet time. Like I'm gonna start trying the things she said, because I want to feel what she was feeling in that minute. I want access to that. I'm like a fairly anxious person. I'm a pretty like high strung, stressed out, whatever. And that did not decrease after like eighth grade. It only got worse. So yeah, I really say that she is the person who like taught me to pray. My parents taught me like the basic prayers or whatever and took me to church, and that's not negligible, but she's the person who inspired me to take my faith and my spirituality into my own hands and like take responsibility for it. And yeah, I mean that's like the greatest gift, right?
That's wonderful. Did she know that story before she read
Oh
it?
yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
she knows.
You guys,
She knows. I have told her.
that's great. And to me, that's a reminder that, we read in the Bible all the time, don't be anxious. I'm like, yeah, easy enough. How many
No,
times
right,
is
yeah.
that in the Bible, right? Like, how do we do that exactly? That sounds good. And that sometimes can make us more anxious when we keep reading that, when you don't have what works for you, and when people can model it for you, it's
hmm
so impactful.
I
Where
also think it's like a really good example of what Pope Francis laid out in his very first document, The Joy of the Gospel, when he's like, look, like Christians, you're not going to attract people by just like through apologetics, right? Like through making logical arguments about why this teaching is correct or whatever. He's like, the way that you get people to want to look into this thing is by living a life that is, sorry, I hit the microphone, but is by living a joyful Christian life. And that doesn't mean you're like fake happy all the time, but it means that people can see that joy and peace that you get from that relationship with God. And sure enough, like that's what got me.
And I also wanted to tell you, I loved in your epilogue, you're talking about looking at your son, your child, and understanding God's love for you, and
Yeah.
love that you have for that child, and those kind of things were just so beautiful in the book. So I really appreciate that.
As I've gotten more in touch with my like kind of centering prayer, like meditative practice again, I've discovered that like my image of God has gotten really maternal. Like, it's just like I just see so much of like, my unconditional love for my kid in my relationship with God, but also in like my kid's unconditional love towards me. Like there's something
I was
of God
just
in that too. Like God is also a child looking at you like that. It's so good. It's so fruitful for reflection.
I think that part when you're on the receiving end of a love like that, where really most of us believe we don't deserve that.
Yeah,
We don't deserve God's unconditional love. And only when you experience it in the world do you begin to think, well, maybe I can accept this kind of love. And it's
that's right.
wonderful when you can get that from a child or from anybody. But
Mm.
I
But in such a pure way.
it
And
is such a pure way. And I will say, I'm a relatively new practitioner of centering prayer myself.
mm,
And as they always say, the gifts of the practice are not while doing the practice. It's in a disposition.
it's in the rest of your life. Yeah.
So with that, I want to thank Colleen for your honesty, creativity, and the grace that you've shared with me today, as well as your wisdom. And with listeners of Read, Pray, Write podcasts, I wish you and our audience all blessings.